The mysterious visitor. The wind howled across the barren planet, carrying ash and dust that danced like restless ghosts. The air smelled of burnt metal and forgotten dreams. In the distance, nestled among jagged rocks and lifeless ground, stood an old forge. Its walls were blackened, its roof barely holding together, and yet it seemed alive, like it was waiting. Ilara pulled her cloak tighter around her shoulders as she approached the forge. Her boots crunched on the ash-covered ground, each step heavier than the last. She hesitated before the massive iron door, worn with age but still imposing. Her fingers brushed over the strange markings carved into its surface. She whispered to herself, "This has to be the place." With a deep breath, she knocked. The sound echoed like a hammer striking an anvil. For a moment, there was only silence. Then came the sound of footsteps from within, slow and deliberate. The door creaked open, revealing a figure cloaked in shadow. "Who are you?" a gruff voice demanded. "I need the Last Blacksmith," Ilara said, her voice steady despite the fear curling in her chest. She tried to peer into the darkness, but the figure remained hidden, the glow of embers behind him casting strange, flickering shapes. The man stepped forward, revealing his face. His skin was weathered like old leather, his eyes sharp and piercing. His hands were large, scared, and strong, hands that had shaped legends. "You found him," he said, his tone carrying both wariness and warning. "But I'm not taking work anymore." Ilara shook her head. "I'm not here to ask. I'm here because I have no choice." The blacksmith, Kale, raised an eyebrow but didn't move aside. "Go back to wherever you came from. You won't find what you're looking for here." She pulled a small, glowing fragment from her pouch and held it up. It was no bigger than her palm, yet it radiated a faint, otherworldly light. The glow reflected in Cal's eyes, and for the first time, his expression changed. It wasn't curiosity, it was something closer to dread. "Where did you get that?" he asked, his voice dropping to a whisper. "It was given to me," Ilara said, "by someone who said you'd understand its importance. They told me you're the only one who can make this into what we need." Cal's jaw tightened. He stepped back into the forge and motioned for her to enter. "Close the door behind you." Inside, the forge was a labyrinth of tools, gears, and relics of old wars. The air was thick with heat and the faint scent of molten metal. A massive anvil stood in the center, its surface smooth from years of work. The forge's heart, a pit of smoldering coals, glowed faintly, as though it hadn't been used in a long time. Kale leaned against a workbench, crossing his arms. "Do you have any idea what you're asking me to do?" "I wouldn't have come all this way if I didn't," Ilara replied, meeting his gaze. "My people are dying. The Veil Hunters are wiping out entire colonies, and we have no way to fight back. They said you're the only one who can help." Kale let out a bitter laugh. "They always say that. The legendary blacksmith who can make anything. The man who built weapons to end wars. Do you know how those stories end, girl?" She didn't flinch. "I don't care about stories. I care about saving lives." For a moment, Kale said nothing. Then he nodded toward the glowing fragment in her hand. "Do you even know what that is?" "It's called the Heart of Stars," she said. "That's all I know." Kale stared at her, then at the fragment. He turned and walked toward the forge's glowing embers, his footsteps heavy. The Heart of Stars is not just a power source. It's alive, in a way. It feeds on its surroundings, and if you don't handle it right, it will destroy everything around it. Ilara followed him, her voice firm. "Then you'll have to teach me how to handle it." He spun to face her, his eyes blazing. "You don't understand. The last time I forged something with a fragment like that, an entire star system burned. Billions of lives gone in an instant. And you want me to try again?" "You're not the one deciding this time," Ilara said, stepping closer. "You think I don't know the risks. You think I want to be here, begging you. My people are desperate. If we do nothing, The Veil Hunters will kill us all. You're our only hope." Kale stared at her for a long moment. The forge crackled softly, as though it was listening to their argument. Finally, he sighed and shook his head. "You'll regret this." "I already regret a lot of things," Ilara said, "but I won't regret trying." Kale turned back to the forge, his hand brushing the edge of the anvil. "Fine. I'll take a look at the fragment. But if I'm doing this, you're going to follow my rules. No questions, no hesitation. Understood?" Ilara nodded. "Understood." The forge began to stir, its embers glowing brighter, as if awakened by their resolve. Kale glanced at her one last time, his expression unreadable. "Let's see if you're as brave as you think you are." The blacksmith's reluctance. The forge roared to life with an uneasy hum. The heart of stars pulsed faintly on the workbench, casting shifting patterns of light and shadow across the walls. It seemed alive, its glow throbbing in rhythm with some unseen heartbeat. Kale stood motionless, staring at it as though it might spring to life and consume them both. Ilara watched him, her patience wearing thin. "You've seen it now," she said, her voice firm. "You know it's real. So why are you hesitating?" Kale let out a low chuckle, though there was no humor in it. "You think it's that simple. I'm supposed to pick up a hammer, light the forge, and save the galaxy. You have no idea what you're asking me to do." Ilara crossed her arms, standing her ground. "I know exactly what I'm asking. I've seen what the Veil Hunters can do. I've seen entire settlements turned to ash. I've seen families torn apart. If you're the man the legends speak of, then you're the only one who can stop them." Kale turned to her, his expression hard. "The legends don't tell you about the cost, do they? They don't tell you what it takes to forge a weapon like the one you're asking for." "What cost?" Ilara demanded, her frustration bubbling over. "Is your guilt worth more than the lives of my people?" Kale slammed his hand on the workbench, the sound reverberating through the forge. "I forged my last masterpiece years ago, a blade so perfect, so powerful, that it could cleave through a planet's core. They told me it would end the war. Do you know what it ended instead?" Ilara took a step back, startled by the intensity in his voice. Kale's eyes burned with a mixture of anger and sorrow as he continued. "An entire star system," he said, his voice trembling. "Billions of lives snuffed out because someone decided to use my creation as a weapon of destruction. Do you want that on your conscience?" The words hung heavy in the air, but Ilara didn't waver. She stepped closer to him, her gaze unwavering. "You're not the one deciding this time. I am. And I'm telling you, we don't have a choice. If we do nothing, the Veil Hunters will destroy us all. You can sit here and drown in your guilt, or you can do something that matters." Kale stared at her, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, the only sound was the crackling of the forge and the faint hum of the heart of stars. Then, with a heavy sigh, he turned away, running a hand through his graying hair. "Even if I agree to this," he said quietly, "it won't be easy. The heart of stars isn't just a power source. It's dangerous. It has a mind of its own. If we make one mistake, it'll consume us both." "Then teach me how not to make mistakes," Ilara said. "I'll do whatever it takes." Kale shook his head. "You're stubborn. I'll give you that." He moved to a nearby shelf, pulling down an ancient tome covered in dust. He set it on the workbench and opened it, revealing pages filled with intricate diagrams and cryptic writing. The light from the heart of stars made the ink shimmer, as though the words were alive. "This is the Codex of the Forge," Kale said. "It contains the knowledge of every master blacksmith who came before me. If we're going to do this, you'll need to learn. This isn't just about hammering metal. It's about understanding the balance between creation and destruction." Ilara leaned over the book, her eyes scanning the pages. The diagrams were unlike anything she had ever seen. Machines that seemed to defy the laws of physics, weapons that looked more like pieces of art than tools of war. She glanced up at Kale. "How long will this take?" "As long as it takes," he replied, his tone firm. You said you're willing to do whatever it takes. Now's your chance to prove it." Ilara nodded, determination etched into her face. "Where do we start?" Kale placed a hand on the heart of stars, his fingers brushing its surface. The glow intensified for a moment, casting sharp shadows across his weathered face. "We start by waking the forge." With that, he grabbed a heavy lever on the wall and pulled it down. The ground beneath them trembled as ancient machinery sprang to life. Gears groaned, steam hissed, and the forge roared like a sleeping giant awakening from a long slumber. The heart of stars responded, its glow pulsing in rhythm with the forge's rumbling. Kale turned to Ilara, his expression grim but resolute. No turning back now. She met his gaze, her resolve unshaken. "I wasn't planning on it." The forge blazed brighter, its heat filling the room as if the very air had caught fire. The journey had begun. A bargain of secrets. The forge glowed with an unnatural intensity, its light pulsating as if in conversation with the heart of stars. Kale stood at the anvil, his hands resting on the worn surface as he stared at Ilara. The woman was stubborn, determined, and hiding something. He could see it in her eyes, the way they darted to the side whenever she thought he wasn't looking. "You're holding back," Kale said finally, his voice cutting through the low rumble of the machinery. "And if you want my help, that stops now." Ilara stiffened, her hand instinctively tightening on the edge of the workbench. "I've told you everything you need to know. My colony is in danger, and we need your skill." Kale shook his head, a bitter smile tugging at the corners of his lips. No one carries a fragment like a heart of stars without knowing exactly what it is, or what it can do. "So, I'll ask again. What aren't you telling me?" Ilara opened her mouth to argue, but the words caught in her throat. She looked down at the glowing fragment, its light reflecting in her eyes. Kale watched her, his patience thinning. "Let me make this simple," he said, stepping closer. "You want my help, you give me the truth. All of it." She hesitated, then exhaled sharply. "Fine. You want the truth. The Veil Hunters aren't just after my colony. They're after you." Kale froze. For a moment, the only sound was the crackle of the forge. Then he laughed. A dry, humorless sound. "That's rich. After all these years, they've decided to come for me. Why now?" Ilara took a step forward, her voice urgent. "Because you're the last blacksmith capable of forging weapons like this. They'd been hunting down every smith with your knowledge, wiping them out one by one. My colony just happened to be in their path." Kale's grip tightened on the edge of the anvil. "So you thought you'd bring them right to my door?" "No," Ilara protested. "I thought you'd want to fight back. Or would you rather they find you unarmed?" Her words hit their mark. Kale turned away, running a hand over his face. The idea of being hunted didn't scare him. He'd faced worse. But the thought of his skills being used again, of his creations bringing more death, that terrified him. "How long?" he asked quietly. Ilara blinked. "What? How long until they get here?" She hesitated, then admitted, "We don't know. They move fast, and their ships don't leave much behind. But they're close." Kale let out a long breath, his shoulders sagging under the weight of her words. He turned back to her, his expression grim. "If we're going to do this, we don't have much time. But you'll need to understand something." "What's that?" she asked. "This isn't just about forging a weapon," Kale said, gesturing to the heart of stars. "This fragment, it's not like anything you've ever seen. It's powerful, yes, but it's also dangerous. It will test you, try to break you. If you're not ready for that, we'll both die before we finish." Ilara squared her shoulders, meeting his gaze without flinching. "I'm ready." Kale studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "We'll see." He turned back to the forge, his hands moving with practiced ease as he began gathering tools and materials. "One more thing," he said without looking at her. "If the Veil Hunters are after me, that means they've already started watching this planet. They'll know we're here soon, if they don't already." Ilara swallowed hard. What do we do? Kale smirked faintly, the expression almost feral. We work fast, and we make something they'll regret finding. The forge roared louder, its flames leaping higher as Kale placed the heart of stars onto the anvil. Its glow intensified, filling the room with a searing light. Ilara shielded her eyes, but Kale didn't flinch. This is it, he said, his voice low but steady. The start of something that could save your people or destroy us all. Are you sure you're ready? Ilara didn't hesitate. Let's begin. Kale raised his hammer, and with the first strike, the forge seemed to come alive, its heat and power radiating like the heartbeat of a god. Outside, the wind howled, and somewhere far off, the shadows of approaching ships began to darken the horizon, forging the impossible. The forge had become a beast unleashed. Its flames roared, licking at the shadows like a living thing, and the air shimmered with unbearable heat. Kale worked without hesitation, his hammer striking the glowing heart of stars with precision. Sparks flew with each blow, cascading like tiny meteors. The ancient machinery groaned and hummed around him, amplifying the rhythmic clang of metal on metal. Ilara stood nearby, sweat dripping down her face as she struggled to keep up. Kale's commands came fast and sharp, leaving no room for error. Bellows. Now. Kale barked. Ilara grabbed the lever and yanked it hard. The forge roared louder as the flames surged, turning white-hot. She coughed, the acrid smoke burning her throat, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. The heart of stars, now a molten core of light, pulsed with dangerous energy. It was alive, and it was fighting back. Why is it doing that? Ilara asked between labored breaths. Kale didn't look up. Because it knows what we're trying to do. The heart doesn't want to be contained. It wants to consume. Keep your focus, or it'll tear this place apart. Ilara's hands trembled as she reached for a pair of tongs, their surface glowing red from the heat. She hesitated, but Kale's voice cut through her fear. No hesitation. Take it out of the fire. She gritted her teeth, grabbed the glowing fragment, and placed it onto the anvil. The heart of stars pulsed violently, sending a shockwave through the room that knocked her back. Kale steadied himself against the workbench, his face grim. It's resisting, he muttered. Of course it is. Ilara pushed herself up, her arms aching from the effort. What do we do now? Kale glanced at her, his eyes sharp. We make it submit. Without another word, he raised his hammer high and brought it down with a force that shook the entire forge. The heart screamed, not with sound, but with a vibration that rattled Ilara's teeth and made her vision blur. She clung to the workbench, her heart pounding as Kale struck again and again. This isn't just forging, Kale said, his voice strained. It's a battle. The heart is testing us, and if we fail, it'll destroy everything. Keep the flames steady. Ilara stumbled to the bellows, her hands shaking as she pumped them with all her strength. The forge responded with a deafening roar, the flames climbing higher and higher. The heart of stars glowed brighter, its light almost blinding. For a moment, Ilara thought it would explode, but then something changed. The light began to stabilize, its pulses slowing. Kale stepped back, breathing hard, and lowered his hammer. He wiped sweat from his brow, his eyes never leaving the fragment. It's listening, he said softly. Ilara let out a shaky breath. That's good, right? Kale nodded, though his expression remained cautious. It's a start, but we're not done yet. As he reached for a pair of calipers, Ilara noticed something strange. The walls of the forge, once covered in soot and grime, now shimmered faintly, as though the light from the heart was seeping into the very structure. She frowned, wiping her forehead with her sleeve. Is the forge supposed to glow? Kale glanced around, his jaw tightening. No, that's new. Before he could say more, a sharp crack echoed through the room. The ground trembled, and a section of the ceiling crumbled, sending a cascade of debris to the floor. Ilara jumped back, her heart racing. "What's happening?" she shouted. Kel's face darkened. "The forge is reacting to the heart's power. It's been dormant for too long, and now it's waking up, whether we want it to or not." Ilara stared at the heart of stars. Its glow steady but ominous. "Can you control it?" Kel picked up his hammer, his grip firm. "I don't need to control it. I need to bend it to my will. And for that, I need your help." He turned to her, his expression fierce. "You said you'd do whatever it takes. Prove it." Ilara swallowed hard, her fear battling her resolve. She nodded. "What do you need?" Kel pointed to a set of gears and levers along the far wall. "Activate the stabilizers. If we don't keep the heart in balance, it'll overload, and we're dead." Ilara sprinted to the controls, dodging falling debris as the forge trembled around her. She pulled one lever after another, the ancient machinery groaning in protest. Steam hissed from hidden vents, and the floor vibrated beneath her feet. She glanced back at Kel, who was hammering the heart with relentless precision. "You better know what you're doing," she yelled over the chaos. Kel smirked, though his eyes remained focused on his work. "If I didn't, we'd already be dead." The forge began to stabilize, its tremors fading as the machinery settled into a rhythmic hum. Ilara collapsed against the wall, her chest heaving. Kel stood over the heart of stars, his hammer resting on the anvil. The fragment, now shaped into a rough, glowing core, seemed almost calm. "Is it done?" Ilara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Kel shook his head. "This was just the beginning. The real work starts now." As he spoke, a faint vibration ran through the ground, different from the forge's earlier tremors. It was distant but unmistakable. Ilara's eyes widened. "Kel," she said, her voice trembling. "That's not the forge." Kel turned toward the door, his expression grim. "The Veil Hunters." The forge, now alive and humming with energy, cast long shadows as Kel and Ilara prepared for what was coming. Time was no longer on their side. The Veil Hunters' shadow. The air inside the forge turned heavy, as if the very planet was holding its breath. Kel stood at the anvil, his hammer poised midair, listening. It wasn't the usual hum of the heart of stars that caught his attention now. It was something else, an unnatural stillness that pressed against his senses like a predator's gaze. "They're here," Kel muttered, his voice barely audible over the forge's rhythmic pulsing. Ilara froze, her hands gripping the edge of the workbench. "What do you mean? How do you know?" Kel didn't answer immediately. He set the hammer down, his movements deliberate and calm, but his eyes flickered with urgency. "You learn to feel it after a while. The Veil Hunters don't just arrive. They infect the space around them. The air, the ground. It all changes." Ilara swallowed hard. "What do we do?" Kel turned to her, his face grim. "We finish this. Whatever happens, that weapon has to be ready." Before Ilara could respond, a low, resonant hum filled the forge. It wasn't from the heart or the machinery. It came from outside. The sound grew louder, vibrating through the walls, making the tools on the shelves rattle. A moment later, a shadow passed over the forge, dimming the already faint light streaming through the cracked windows. Ilara's heart raced. "Is that?" Kel nodded. "They're ships. They'll scan the area first, but once they know we're here, they'll come." The heart of stars flared suddenly, its light intensifying, as if it sensed the danger. The forge responded, its flames leaping higher, casting chaotic shadows across the room. Kel grabbed a pair of tongs and carefully lifted the glowing core from the anvil, its surface swirling with patterns of energy. He placed it into a containment chamber, locking it with a heavy, intricate mechanism. "We don't have time for perfection," Kel said, his voice tight. "This is going to be rough, but it'll work. I need you to stabilize the energy flow while I shape the housing." Ilara rushed to the controls, her fingers flying over the levers and dials. "How long do we have before they?" Her question was answered by the deafening crash of something slamming into the ground outside. The forge shook violently, dust and debris raining from the ceiling. Ilara stumbled, gripping the console for support. "They're not waiting," she said, panic creeping into her voice. Kale grabbed a blade-like frame he'd been working on earlier, its edges glowing faintly with the heart's energy. "They never do. Keep the flow steady, no matter what happens." The forge's machinery groaned as Kel worked, his movements faster now, almost desperate. Each strike of his hammer sent arcs of energy crackling through the air. The heart of stars pulsed in response, its light growing brighter with every blow. Outside, the hum of the Veil Hunter's ships grew louder. Shadows danced along the walls as something moved past the windows. Tall, angular figures with an eerie, fluid motion. Ilara's breath hitched. She had heard the stories, but nothing could have prepared her for seeing them up close. "Kale," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They're here." Kale didn't look up. Then we're out of time. A loud metallic screech came from the forge's entrance as the massive iron door buckled under an unseen force. Ilara turned to Kale, her voice rising. "What do we do?" Kale's expression hardened. He placed the unfinished weapon into her hands, its surface warm and humming with power. "Take this. Get to the back room and lock the door. Don't come out until I say." Ilara shook her head, panic overtaking her resolve. "I can't just leave you." Kale grabbed her by the shoulders, his grip firm. "Listen to me. You're the only one who can finish this now. If they get their hands on the heart, it's over. For your people, for everyone. Do you understand?" Before she could respond, the door burst open, and a Veil Hunter stepped inside. Its form was humanoid but elongated, its movements unnervingly smooth. Its face was a featureless mask, glowing faintly with the same energy as the heart. It tilted its head, as if observing them, before stepping forward. "Go!" Kale barked, shoving Ilara toward the back room. Ilara stumbled but obeyed, clutching the weapon tightly as she ran. She glanced back once, just in time to see Kale pick up his hammer and face the Veil Hunter. His voice carried through the chaos, steady and defiant. "You picked the wrong forge." The last thing Ilara saw before the door slammed shut was Kale lunging forward, his hammer raised, and the forge erupting into a blinding light. The masterpiece unveiled. The forge was silent now, save for the faint hum of the weapon in Ilara's trembling hands. She sat in the back room, her heart pounding as she strained to hear anything beyond the heavy metal door Kel had slammed shut. The air felt thick, charged with energy from the heart of stars, which pulsed faintly through the walls like a heartbeat. Then came the sound she dreaded. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, impossibly heavy. They weren't Kel's. Ilara tightened her grip on the weapon. It was nearly complete, its frame sleek and glowing faintly, but it felt alien in her hands. She had no idea how to wield it, let alone unleash its potential. Her breath caught as the footsteps stopped just outside the door. A loud creak echoed as the door handle twisted, then stopped. A faint vibration filled the room, and Ilara's skin prickled as the Veil Hunter probed the space with its strange, energy-seeking presence. The hum of the heart inside the weapon intensified, and for a terrifying moment, Ilara thought it would give her away. The footsteps retreated. The tension in her chest eased, but she knew it was only a matter of time. She had to act. Kel wasn't coming for her, not this time. Ilara stood, her legs shaking, and approached the forge's main chamber. She peeked through the crack in the door. What she saw made her blood run cold. Kel was slumped against the far wall, his hammer lying a few feet away, its handle cracked. The forge was still ablaze, the heart of stars locked in its containment chamber, but the Veil Hunters were inside now. 3 of them, their featureless faces glowing as they surrounded Kel like wolves closing in on a wounded prey. Ilara gritted her teeth. "You're not taking him, or this weapon." She pushed the door open and stepped into the chamber, the weapon humming louder in her hands. The Veil Hunters turned toward her in unison, their glowing faces shifting slightly, as if registering her presence. One of them stepped forward, its movements impossibly fluid. A deep, resonant voice filled the room, not spoken, but felt, vibrating through Ilara's bones. "Child of dust, surrender the relic. It does not belong to you." Ilara's grip tightened. "It belongs to no one but those willing to fight for it." The Veil Hunter tilted its head. "Your defiance is futile. The heart will consume you." Ilara glanced at Kull, who was watching her now, his face pale but his eyes sharp. He gave her a faint nod, his lips moving silently. "Use it." She took a deep breath and shifted her grip on the weapon. It felt alive, pulsing in her hands, as if waiting for her to unlock its true power. She pressed her thumb against a faintly glowing symbol on its hilt, and the weapon responded immediately. The chamber filled with light as the weapon surged to life. Its sleek frame extended, glowing arcs of energy forming into a shimmering blade. The Veil Hunters recoiled slightly, their glowing faces flickering. Kell's voice rang out, hoarse but determined. "That's it, Ilara. Make it obey you." The lead Veil Hunter lunged forward, its elongated arms stretching unnaturally toward her. Ilara swung the blade, and it carved through the air with a sound like a crack of thunder. The Veil Hunter's arm shattered into fragments of light before dissipating entirely. The creature staggered back, its body flickering as if struggling to remain whole. The other two Veil Hunters moved in, their movements faster now, more aggressive. Ilara backed toward the forge, her mind racing. The weapon was powerful, but she didn't know how long she could keep it stable. Kell's voice cut through her panic. "The forge. Use the forge to amplify it." Ilara glanced at the containment chamber. The heart of stars glowed within, its energy surging in rhythm with the weapon. She turned toward the forge's central controls and saw the lever Kell had used earlier. It was marked with strange symbols, glowing faintly as if waiting for her command. The Veil Hunters were closing in. Ilara took a deep breath and sprinted toward the controls. The lead Veil Hunter lunged, but she ducked beneath its swipe, rolling across the floor and slamming her hand onto the lever. The forge responded instantly. The flames roared higher, and the heart of stars pulsed brighter, its energy flowing directly into the weapon. Ilara felt the surge, her body vibrating with the raw power coursing through her hands. She turned to face the Veil Hunters, her fear replaced by a fierce resolve. The weapon now glowed with an intensity that lit the entire chamber. She raised it high and brought it down in a sweeping arc. A blinding wave of energy erupted from the blade, engulfing the Veil Hunters. They didn't scream. They simply dissolved into fragments of light, scattered and consumed by the power of the forge. The chamber fell silent, the only sound the faint hum of the weapon and the crackle of the forged flames. Ilara stood there, her chest heaving, the weapon still glowing faintly in her hands. Kale let out a weak chuckle, his voice strained. Not bad for a first-timer. Ilara rushed to his side, dropping the weapon and kneeling beside him. "Don't you dare die on me, old man." Kale smirked, wincing as he sat up. "Not yet. There's still work to do." Ilara glanced at the weapon, its glow dimming as it rested on the ground. The Veil Hunters were gone, but she knew this was far from over. "Then let's finish it," she said, her voice steady. Kale nodded, his expression grim but proud. "We just might survive this after all." The final stand. The air outside the forge crackled with tension, the sky above an eerie shade of black. The Veil Hunters' ships hovered like silent predators, their angular forms blending with the darkness. Ilara stood at the forge's entrance, the weapon in her hands glowing faintly, its power subdued but ready. Behind her, Kale leaned heavily against the doorway, his face pale but determined. "They'll come in waves now," Kale said, his voice rough. "They won't stop until they have the heart, or until we're gone." Ilara tightened her grip on the weapon. Its energy pulsed through her fingers, filling her with a strange, almost unnerving confidence. "Then they'll have to go through me." Kale gave a weak chuckle. That's the spirit. Just try not to blow up the planet while you're at it. A low, resonant hum filled the air, growing louder with each passing second. Ilara turned her gaze upward and saw them. Veil hunters descending from the ships, their forms shifting and liquid-like as they moved. There were dozens, maybe more, their glowing faces fixed on the forge. Ilara swallowed hard. Any last-minute advice? Kale straightened slightly, his eyes sharp despite his exhaustion. The weapon isn't just a blade. It's a conductor. It channels the heart's energy into whatever you will it to be. But if you push too hard, it'll consume me, Ilara finished, her voice steady. Kale nodded. Control it. Don't let it control you. The Veil Hunters touched down, their movements unnaturally smooth as they spread out in a wide arc around the forge. One stepped forward, taller than the rest, its presence commanding. When it spoke, its voice resonated like 1,000 whispers, all layered into one. Surrender the heart. There is no victory here, only inevitability. Ilara stepped forward, raising the weapon. Its glow intensified, casting sharp shadows across the ground. If you want it, come and take it. The lead Veil Hunter tilted its head, as if amused. Then it raised a hand, and the others surged forward. Ilara didn't wait. She swung the weapon in a wide arc, and a wave of energy erupted from the blade, cutting through the first line of Veil Hunters like a scythe through grass. Their forms dissolved into fragments of light, but more took their place, their movements relentless. She moved with them, the weapon an extension of her will. Each strike sent shockwaves rippling through the air, but the effort was draining. The weapon's power was immense, but it was also volatile. She could feel it pushing back, testing her control. Ilara, behind you. Kel's shout snapped her back to the moment. She spun just in time to block a strike from a Veil Hunter that had closed the distance. Its glowing arm clashed against the blade, sending sparks flying. The impact reverberated through her body, but she held firm, shoving it back with a burst of energy. The lead Veil Hunter stepped forward again, its voice cutting through the chaos. You wield the heart, yet you do not understand its burden. It will destroy you, as it has destroyed so many before. Ilara gritted her teeth. I'm not afraid of it. The creature extended its hand, and a wave of energy slammed into her, sending her sprawling to the ground. The weapon skidded out of reach, its glow dimming. The Veil Hunter loomed over her, its form shifting like liquid metal. Kale struggled to his feet, grabbing a heavy wrench from the forge. You're not touching her, he roared, charging forward. He swung the wrench with all his strength, striking the Veil Hunter in its side. The creature staggered, but its focus remained on Ilara. Ilara crawled toward the weapon, her fingers brushing its hilt just as the Veil Hunter raised its hand for a final blow. She grabbed it, and the weapon roared to life, its energy surging back with renewed intensity. The light was blinding, and the Veil Hunter hesitated. Ilara rose to her feet, the weapon humming in her hands. She didn't swing it this time. Instead, she closed her eyes and focused, drawing the heart's energy inward. She could feel it resisting, trying to overpower her, but she held firm. The forge responded, its flames roaring higher, feeding the weapon's power. The light grew brighter and brighter until it engulfed everything. Ilara opened her eyes, and for a moment, she saw not just the Veil Hunters, but the vastness of the universe itself, the stars, the void, the endless cycle of creation and destruction. The Veil Hunter stepped back, its form flickering. What are you doing? It demanded, its voice tinged with fear. Ilara smiled faintly. Finishing this. She unleashed the energy in a single concentrated burst. It radiated outward, a wave of light that swept across the battlefield, disintegrating the Veil Hunters in its path. Their forms dissolved into nothingness, their ships vanishing into the void as if they had never been. When the light faded, the forge was silent once more. Ilara stood in the center, the weapon still glowing faintly in her hands. She turned to Kel, who was slumped against the wall, a faint smile on his face. "Not bad," he said weakly. "Not bad at all." Ilara dropped the weapon and rushed to his side. "We did it." Kale nodded, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. "The heart. It listens to you now. You've earned its respect." She looked at the weapon, its glow steady and calm. "What do I do with it?" Kel's smile faded, and his expression turned serious. "You take it. You protect it. And when the time comes, you pass it to someone who's worthy." Ilara nodded, the weight of his words settling on her shoulders. The Veil Hunters were gone, but her journey was far from over. She had a weapon forged from the heart of stars, and a legacy to uphold. As the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, Ilara stood tall, the weapon at her side, ready to face whatever came next.